This episode is proudly supported by Pepe Sayer Australian Cultured Butter.
The Pepe Sayer all new Australian butter sheets. Everything we've learned over the last 12 years, we've put into making this new butter sheet. Combined with a brand spanking new shiny machine from Switzerland, we're able now to produce this beautiful butter sheet that's so easy to laminate with. So it's pliable, it's very fresh. If you're an Australian baker buying our butter sheets, they're made weekly. The formulation, it's a beautiful unsalted butter that will work for savoury and sweet. I think it's a perfect balance there. The bakers and pastry chefs that are using it are just raving about it.
For more information, go to pepesayer.com.au.
I have a friend who said to me at some point, I think when I was a few years into my job with Anthony Bourdain, and she said, wow, you've really made a career out of the care and feeding of difficult men.
Hey everyone, it is Dani Valent here with an episode of Dirty Linen. We chat about hospitality and the issues in the food world around... Oh, sorry, I might start that again. I'm actually a bit nervous because you're such a good writer. No, it's okay. All right. Hey everyone, it is Dani Valent here with an episode of Dirty Linen. I'm really excited about this one. I love all the conversations, but I'm particularly thrilled to welcome today's guest. We chat a lot about hospitality culture on this podcast. We wonder if things have changed for women and other marginalised groups in the food world. We look at the implications, sometimes the wreckage, maybe even the redemption. Laurie Woolever is an American writer and former chef. She was Mario Batali's assistant in New York, and she worked with Anthony Bourdain for nearly a decade. Laurie has just written a memoir, Care and Feeding. Welcome, Laurie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you on the show. I know you also recently co-wrote Richard Hart Bread, a book with that wonderful baker. Richard's going to be in Melbourne for the Food and Wine Festival this year, and I thought we could start there because you also came to Melbourne for our Food and Wine Festival.
I did. It was 22 years ago in 2002, and it was with Mario Batali.
It was towards the end of your time working with him. I just wonder if you could tell us that story, because I think it sort of throws us into your life at the time, what things were like for you, and what it was like working with a person, who I guess a lot of people have heard a lot about, not all of it great, but take us into that space.
Sure. So I had been Mario's assistant already for about 3 years, and he was invited to be a presenter at the Melbourne Food and Wine Festival. And so he brought me, and he also brought a chef, Mark Ladner. The three of us flew from New York to Europe to Singapore to Melbourne, which is about 36 hours of travel. And it was very exhausting. And even though I was young, I was in my late 20s, I still found it to be very challenging just to get to Australia on that route. And Mario did a number of cooking demonstrations and appearances at dinners, and Mark and I kind of worked behind the scenes to get the food plated and to make sure everything was the way it was supposed to be. I had been working for Mario for a while, and I at first really enjoyed the lifestyle that came with that. It was a lot of dinners out and heavy drinking and staying out late and travel and partying, and it was, for a while, it was the dream. By the time we got to Melbourne in 2002, I was quite tired of all of it. And I didn't fully understand that part of my job really was to party with Mario. It wasn't just a fun perk if I wanted to. It was really a requirement if you were going to be on the road with him. So he was quite upset with me because I had a terrible cold, and that became a sinus infection over the course of the flights to Melbourne, and I was just feeling horrible. So anytime I had an opportunity, I was back in my hotel room in my bed just trying to rest. And it was made known to me that this was really unacceptable behavior, that I wouldn't be a wingman for him. So I as much as I loved Melbourne, I truly was all of us were so impressed with the food culture, with the care that people took with their food, everything from beautiful, multi-course meal at Flower Drum to a simple croissant in a bakery. There was just such an extraordinary level of love and care for food that was surprising and really exciting to us. People couldn't have been more lovely, but I left that trip feeling really deflated and demoralized, and I felt that someday I'd like to get back to Australia because I would like to experience it with a clear head and, feeling like my time was my own and really get to enjoy it the way that it's meant to be enjoyed.
Yeah, well, you should come back. Flower Drum is still going strong. I just really could see you at the table. You describe it so vividly, as you do throughout the book. The writing is extraordinary and very immediate, but you're sitting at the table at Flower Drum, you're sort of calculating how many courses there are to go and how long you're going to need to keep sitting there, and you start silently crying, and Mario just like dresses you down, and it's a really, I don't know, it sounds humiliating and deeply upsetting. And it's, long dinners and travel and all that stuff can be really grueling. But I think to be caught up in that world of Mario Batali, like a mercurial, charismatic, but also a bully, an abuser, like not a nice person in lots of ways. I found that whole section so moving because you felt like you were lucky in lots of ways to be there and to be learning everything you were, to be really thrown into the center of that dynamic New York food scene. It felt like you were at the center of that world, but at the same time, you weren't treated with respect. I think so often as women, we minimize the things that are done to us or the scenarios that we find ourselves in. Oh, it's not that bad, or there are good things about it. Like, how do you reconcile that from, this perspective?
Yeah, it's something I've given a lot of thought to, and I try and handle it with some care in the book now that I've got 22 years of perspective on it. And there, part of me now, being much older and maybe marginally wiser, I still feel like, well, it wasn't that big a deal, especially in light of hearing about some of the things that other women experienced around Mario later on, years down the road, that were much more serious. And I am just always. It's just part of my DNA that I'm always sort of backing away from the idea that I was assaulted or that I was a victim. It was fairly minor. But that being said, it's impossible to fault any one of us who were just trying our best at that time, because all we knew was the moment that we were in. I don't think, even if somebody had said, listen, in about 10 or 20 years, things are going to change a lot, and the attitudes around women and the way that people treat each other, it's going to get better. A, I wouldn't have believed it, and B, it wouldn't have mattered at the time. I made the decisions that I made with the information that I had, and I think that's the case with every woman that sort of struggled with the at times sexist culture, or people of non-white people that struggled with what can be, frankly, a very racist culture. We all just were doing the best we could to hold on to our jobs, to hold on to our dignity as best we could, to keep our senses of humor. And I would like to think that things are much different now. And I can't really speak to how things are day to day in restaurants, because I don't work in restaurants anymore. From what I understand, the attitudes are shifting, the norms of behavior are shifting. People feel more empowered to speak out or to organize among themselves, and those are all really positive things. But as I say in the book, you can't really legislate or litigate out certain aspects of human behavior and human needs and drives. And so all we can do is just try and do a little better, try and be a little kinder to each other, or a little more empathetic toward each other, and hope for the best. It's such a hard time right now, too, because I'm sure you're aware, American politics are so deeply distressing and messy right now. And, I think it's all related, this bully culture and, the abuse of power, and all of these things feel very connected.
Yeah, well, I think we're probably not immune from fallout from the American mess, and there's certainly, we're in an election year, and I think that the right wing politicians are really looking to Trump and Musk, and it's reading from the playbook. So it's a very terrifying time, and definitely feels like, as much as we've come a long way in terms of feeling able to speak out and being protected, that when you see how fragile some of those protections are, and even the language to speak about things when words are being banned. I just think, wow, I didn't know things were so fragile.
Right. It really is. I mean, I just finished writing a letter to my senator, and the idea that even things that are constitutionally encoded are now up for debate. Apparently, I'm quite tired of living in interesting times. I'm ready for some boring times, but I don't know that that's on the menu for the next several years. So we'll see.
Yeah, boring would be great. There's a tension in the book between being an insider and being an outsider. You sort of see these worlds that you really want to be part of, but you also are terrified by them, and you feel like you're never going to belong. Can you talk a bit about that that tension between being an insider and an outsider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that I think has been a running theme through my life since I was a little kid. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this. I was never quite confident of my social standing, and was never sure if I was pretty enough, or, always felt a little bit that I was running to catch up with whatever it was that I imagined was the right look or the right place to be, the right school or whatever it was. Even, I got to college, it was the same thing. I'm not the best student, kind of struggled romantically. And then that just carried on into my professional life. There were certain publications where I really wanted to work, and it became apparent pretty quickly that there is a combination of factors that gets a person into those positions, those very coveted jobs, which many of them don't exist anymore. But this was a time in media when there still was a very vital system of jobs in print magazines, and web was starting to emerge as well. There was a combination of family wealth and looks and social connections and education and luck, probably, and timing. And I never quite figured out how to crack the code to get to one of those jobs. And I think that's probably for the best, honestly. No, looking back now, I don't think I was at all cut out for those environments. I think I would have, been banging my head against the wall from day one. But it was just one of those things where the more that you can't have it, the more you want it, and the more it seems like if only I got that editor job at GQ or Bon Appetit or whatever it was, then my life would be perfect. But it's... I'm reminded of the famous Graydon Carter speech that he gave to some underling about how there's always more rooms, and you think you want to get into one room, but you get in that room and then you realize there's 11 more rooms that you're not invited into. And I think that was very much the case in media in New York at the time when I was really desperate and striving to be considered part of it. So I made my little gains. I had some bylines and I had some good jobs, but there was a striving to be in the inner circle. And the truth is that there's always another inner circle that you're going to be excluded from until you're whoever, the president, the publisher, whoever it is, the owner. And I think those are lonely positions too. You mentioned that the food media landscape, or the media landscape generally, has changed so much over the decades. Like, where do you think food media is now? Like, what do you think? Do you think there are things about it that are better now? Do you think it's not as well funded as perhaps it used to be? But, are there good things about it as well? Yeah, I think there's probably a balance of good and bad. When I was starting out in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was so much money sloshing around for all kinds of, beautiful print magazines and 12-page advertorial sections, which really only benefit the writer who gets to write those. And I was lucky to get some of those positions. And you're writing the same kind of content that would go in the magazine, but you're getting paid about 10 times as much. And I don't know that I'm sure that exists in some form, but there was just a sense of abundance, and having a media job meant you could aspire to a certain lifestyle, and you could pay your rent or maybe even buy an apartment. And a lot of that is contracted as a result of, the incursion of the internet, and everyone's still trying to figure out what is the business model that makes for a solvent publication. On the upside, the kinds of things that are being written about and people are interested in, and the stories that are being told are so much more interesting and so much more diverse than was the case when I was first starting out, when everything seemed to be about fancy tasting menus and caviar and golf courses and luxury travel. And it was just a very narrow slice of what is available in the world to eat and drink and see in your travels. And now there is so much more openness to all kinds of food from all around the world, and also an acknowledgement that when people are home, when people are just trying to live their lives and feed their families, their needs are different, and that there's a whole world of food content now that really just speaks to the average person who wants to make a good tasting dinner for their family.
You lean into the writing side of your skill set, but the memoir's called Care and Feeding. So I'd love you to just talk about that. You're a writer, but the feeding side is obviously central. Why did you call it Care and Feeding, and talk about those words?
I have a friend who said to me at some point, I think when I was a few years into my job with Anthony Bourdain, and she said, "Wow, you've really made a career out of the care and feeding of difficult men," which always sort of stuck with me. And I had never really seen myself that way, that I had this series of jobs that were sort of supporting the aims of ambitious and in some cases difficult men, although I wouldn't classify Tony Bourdain as difficult to my perspective. But she was right. And I have been cooking in one way or another since I was in college, something that I really enjoyed doing for its own sake, just for the craft of cooking. I find that very satisfying. And then, of course, there's a practical application of then you eat it, right? And you feed your family or you feed your friends or at some point I went to culinary school, and then before that, I was working as a private cook for a family, which is an early kind of crazy chapter in the book. This has been, I have figured out a way more or less throughout my career to make a living with my knowledge of and interaction with food. And there is also a thread in the book about becoming a wife and becoming a mother and the kinds of care and feeding that's required of one in those roles in life, and how sometimes I would chafe against those roles. But ultimately, at the end of the day, that's really all I've got. I've got my cooking skills, I've got my son, I've got, thank God I've got, a place to live and running water, and that's the important stuff. The glamour and the travel and the craziness, that kind of fades away, and ultimately it's, who's around you, who are you caring for, who are you feeding?
You spent almost 10 years working with Anthony Bourdain. He's such a interesting, complex character. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with him? What was it like being so close to him for so long?
Sure. So I first met him in 2002. Mario Batali introduced us. I needed to figure out my next job, and he was looking for someone to help him with his first cookbook called Anthony Bourdain's Leal Cookbook. And that was a great first experience. He was professional. He paid me on time. He was happy with my work. We worked really well together. And then there was a period of years. I did one event with him, sort of a one-off event that he needed help with. And then he hired me as his assistant in 2009 when my son was an infant. And Again, he was a great boss. I felt respected. I was paid well. I worked hard and I did everything I could to please him, and he appreciated it. And he created opportunities for me as a writer and editor so that I was not simply doing the administrative work that an assistant does, but I also was contributing creatively and starting to develop my own work creatively. Certainly helped with his connections, and he had me do some line editing on some of the books that on his book imprint, and then we ended up writing a cookbook together. So I know a lot of people have had a lot of different experiences with him, making television, working in restaurants. For me, it was a really good fit, and I think probably part of what made it successful is that we were, he was traveling all over the world and I was home. And so I didn't have to go into an office. We didn't have the opportunity to drive each other crazy the way you sometimes do when you're, in an office with someone all the time. It was just a great fit for me and my needs as a new mother, and for him as someone who was never home and needed someone to sort of be a rock in New York, keeping it all together for him.
I mean, can you point to things that you learnt from him about food or food culture, and similarly, what would he have learnt from you?
That's an interesting question. I learned, as everyone else did, watching him on television, I learned all kinds of things about, various food cultures around the world. I was very lucky to travel with him. When my son was a little bit older, maybe 4 years into the job, he said, would you like to go on some trips with us? You can choose a location from this season and I'll cover your expenses and you can go and travel with us. So through that very generous perk, I got to go to Hue, Vietnam, where I learned about the imperial cuisine of Hue, which is really interesting, delicate, beautiful, lots of little dishes. And learned about all of the horrible war history there with the United States, and the burgeoning youth culture, all of these things. I rode a motorcycle with him, around the city, which was kind of scary and kind of fascinating. I went to Sri Lanka with him, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Okinawa, some really exciting places. And for someone living in North America, great to have someone pay your business class airfare to get so far away. That was a huge perk. From him as a person, I learned a lot of things. I learned about sort of not taking yourself too seriously, remaining open-minded, and remaining curious, keeping your eyes open to the world, being on time. I mean, he's very famously punctual, and not even just punctual, but psychotically early, as he would say. And that was something that my parents taught me, to at least be on time, but really be early is the more polite thing. And so I even went more extreme, because the goal was to always be earlier than Tony, so you weren't making him wait. So I'm trying to teach that to my son now. As far as what he learned from me, gosh, that's a great question. I don't know, honestly. I mean, I would like to think, I really don't know. Maybe he learned a little bit about where I came from, which is New York State, a small town. There was a time where he did a television shoot for a whiskey endorsement, and he ended up, just by total coincidence, about a mile from the place where I grew up, which was really bizarre. It's just a place that nobody goes for any reason. And to think Tony was there, a mile from my childhood home, shooting a whiskey commercial was really cool. And he had a lot of questions about this, tiny little dairy farm community in upstate New York. So I don't know. I never have given it a minute of thought about what he might have learned from me, but I just know that I was, I supported him. I kept his life together, his logistics together.
I've co-written a few cookbooks with people. I try to do one project a year where someone whose first language isn't English, I help them tell their story and bring their recipes to life. And I find it so interesting to get into someone else's voice, to sort of be able to inhabit them in a little way and, help them say what they want to say. You've done a lot of co-writing, but you've now written your own memoir. Can you talk about that, the voice and that balance between getting in someone else's headspace and also finding your own?
Well, I think that my own voice is quite strong because I've been writing in some form or another since I was a kid. And I think it's a voice that I have developed over many years. So I don't have a lot of questions about that. But the tricky part comes when my voice starts to override. If I'm doing a collaborative project, I need to be careful that my voice doesn't override someone else's. You brought up Richard Hart, and this is a good example. Richard has a very distinctive voice, which is very different from mine. And early on, we had some clashes because he would say some things, I would record them and transcribe them, and then try and put them into some essay format of different stories that he was telling, and he really chafed at all of the polishing that I had done, and it was like, well, that's how I would say it. So, and he had to sort of remind me, like, we're very different. Listen to me talk, look at where I'm from. You have to sort of pull back a little bit. And then I pulled back too much, and he was like, "Oh God, I sound crazy," So it was a matter of coming up with the right balance, and it was a really good lesson, that just because there's something I would say a certain way, that's not the only way to say it, and I don't want to, obliterate the other person's voice. But the more I do it, I think the better I get at it. With Tony, there were times where I would write something. Like the head notes, for instance, in our book, Appetites, I wrote all the head notes for the recipes just to have a placeholder and then gave them to him. And I tried my best to write what I thought he might write. And in some cases, he scratched them out completely and wrote his own. In some cases, he made some edits. In some cases, he left them completely intact. So Tony had such a strong voice, and I was able to just observe it for long enough that I felt I could do a decent facsimile of it. And sometimes he would accept it as his own.
There was this, there's so many great lines in the book, but when you talk about Tony Bourdain's voice, you say, and then he would do his listen up dipshits bit. It's just such a great description. So concise and so fresh. I just love it. There's a lot in the book about substance abuse and addiction. You describe yourself as a relatively high-functioning addict in a world of temptation. And there's a part where you ponder if you felt so bad because you got so out of it, or if you got out of it because you felt so bad. I mean, what was it like wrangling with these questions in the landscape of a restaurant or the food world?
Well, for the most part, early on when I was working for Mario, with a few exceptions, I didn't see myself as having a problem. I just thought, well, I'm in my 20s, I'm having a good time. Yeah, I like to have some drinks, but look around me, everyone likes to have some drinks. It was very difficult to see that anything I was doing was a problem because it was just what everyone else was doing. That's a very easy trap to fall into especially in the restaurant world. So, there were points, and I write about it in the book, there were a few points where I thought, oh no, maybe I really do have a problem. But for the most part, it was, I'm a fish swimming in water, but I don't know what water is. It's sort of the David Foster Wallace famous essay about this is water. As time went on, I got out of the restaurant world, but then I was, then I had a real taste for alcohol and a real habit to support. So there was, with private cooking or catering, there's always a way to get a drink. And then there's just, okay, now I'm an adult and I have a little spending money. So let me just make sure I've always got, booze in the house, and let me go get my weed set up. It's not hard to find these things and to, especially living in a city like New York. I mean, there's so many bars and restaurants and, other people that want to get out and have a good time. It was, I don't know what it might have been like for me had I been in a different career, but I think I didn't choose a different career because I wanted a career that allowed me the sort of flexibility and freedom to mix up my social life with my professional life.
And I mean, how have you wrangled with that in the years since?
So, I mean, there came a point where I realized, okay, I do have a problem and I need to get some help and to fix this. You know, I was very lucky that I didn't get to a point where I needed to be hospitalized or rehabbed or anything like that. No one had to intervene. Plenty of people had said to me things over the years, which I completely ignored, but I was fortunate that I figured it out early enough to where I was under my own steam that I took myself to a 12-step meeting and then just took myself to another one the next day and the next day after that and kind of kept going. And that was 8 years ago. That was 8 years ago. And I consider myself fully sober for 6.5 years. And it's, you know, I just feel really lucky that I figured it out and that I gave it a chance. You know, this is did not feel like the most natural thing in the world to go sit in a dingy room with a bunch of people telling their stories about their drug and alcohol abuse. But there was something that kept me coming back, and here I am, and you know, what a relief. And there's a lot of promises and things that people say when you first get into a 12-step room about, you know, you won't believe how amazing your life is, and cash and prizes and all these things that sound like absolute horseshit, if I can curse. And sure enough, they come true. And it's not a literal, you know, no one's dropping off cash and prizes at my door. But my life is great because it's calm and it's normal, and I have a nice relationship with my son, and I feel, you know, I don't hate myself, and I get good sleep, you know, all these things that I don't think I knew how important they were, or how much difference it would make in my life just to be clear-headed. And, you know, if people can drink or use their recreational substances safely and in a moderate way, fantastic. You know, whatever anyone else does is their business. But for me, my life is much better without that stuff.
Yeah, it's great that it's great. There's a part in the book where you're working as a private chef and you're cooking. It sounds like the most boring food for some very buttoned up rich people. Can you talk about the type of food that you love to cook?
Yeah, I love to cook pasta. I really got schooled in the techniques of cooking pasta when I was working for Mario, when I was researching the recipes for the Babbo cookbook and for his television show. And it's always a pleasure. It's something I love to eat. I love to serve it to other people. And it could be anything from, you know, very simple. I make this dish for my son all the time. It's just spaghetti tossed with a couple of eggs and a little bit of truffle oil and some grated Parmesan cheese or ricotta if I've got it. And it's just, you know, it's warm and rich and satisfying, and it feels like kind of a magic trick. It's just pasta, eggs, and cheese, right? But if you capture the warmth of the just cooked pasta and put it back in the pan and let the eggs get cooked but not scrambled, and you know, that kind of thing I love. I love to having, you know, really humble ingredients and making something that's just really satisfying. Of course, fat is always kind of the key to that. And I think that's one of the important things I learned in culinary school is you don't need a lot of big fancy ingredients that are very expensive. But if you've got some butter and some potatoes and some onions, garlic, salt and pepper, you can make a lot of really delicious things.
Yum. Can you make that for me one day? That sounds really good. You know, we started this podcast talking a little bit about, you know, these interesting times that we're in. And, you know, frankly, it can be terrifying to be a human these days. But at the same time, you know, there is pasta and there is butter and there is salt. You know, where do you see simple pleasures and basic needs in a world that also feels like a bit of a runaway train or perhaps a rocket exploding on its way to Mars?
Yeah. I was just thinking this morning, I was like, you know, thank God I have a sense of humor and that I can find, you know, humor in that my particular sense of humor is toward the absurd and the ridiculous and the sometimes, you know, shocking or appalling. that, the more sort of horrifying and gruesome something is, the more I can laugh at it. Of course, with limits. I mean, there are certain things that are just not funny. But I don't know where I would be in the last month or so in the US anyway, without trying to find some absurd humor in everything. And so that's a simple pleasure. I watch some of the dumbest reality television. And this morning I watched a new episode of a new season of a show that I love. And, I was like, this couldn't be more worthless. And yet for these 42 minutes, I am so happy watching this show. I love watching my son grow up, and I have a cat who likes to sit on my lap. I mean, these things that I think I always was aware of these things in the world when I was drinking and using drugs, but I didn't realize how valuable they were. It was always like, well, I want this job, or I want this bit of recognition, or I want this person to notice me, or whatever it is that I was chasing. But these really simple pleasures, and it sounds so kind of corny and cliche, but it's really true. I can make a really good cup of coffee in the morning, and I've got running water in my apartment, and all these little things. But humor is a huge one. I mean, it's just such a relief to talk to a friend and be like, "Did you see this latest thing? Can you believe this? This is insane." And make a little meme about it, or share a joke about it. It's just a moment of relief in a tough world.
Yeah. Laurie, I'm really thrilled to be chatting to you, and I love the book. Highly recommend everyone checks out Care and Feeding. Thank you so much for chatting with us. Really appreciate it, and hope the book does really well.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This